The century went on. As it moves toward its latter part, it was a time of great transition. Transitions in art and culture, literature, but also transition in politics, in empire, and in the issues of religion and faith, as the institutional Catholic Church now begins to pull away from being directly involved in politics to assuming a more spiritual role. Let us turn ourselves back to China, where in the 1850s and the 1860s a new form of revolution was brewing, calling itself the Taiping, the Heavenly Kingdom. It was led by Hong Xiuquan, who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He wanted to get rid of the old Confucian and the old Buddhist religious traditions, the old Taoist religious traditions as well, and instead impose a syncretic style of Christianity. Remember religious syncretism, where you can bring Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism in part, but he wanted to apply a very strong form of Christianity. Hong Xiuquan was a Protestant by conversion. He believed that the Qings were demons. And this is very much an ethnic revolt because Hong Xiuquan is from the Hakudu, or the Han heartland Chinese, who resisted the Manchurians, who had taken over the government of China. They wanted to eliminate foreigners, especially missionaries. This is a very xenophobic movement here. But on the other side, they believed in equality for women, at least to a certain degree. They believed in land reform and redistribution, almost a proto-communistic style of land redistribution. And they wanted to end some of the more arcane Chinese customs, the most brutal of which was called foot wrapping, in which women had their feet wrapped to such a way that their toes were warped literally underneath their own heels. That's how bad the foot wrapping was. They initiated a civil war, which is known as the Taiping Rebellion, or the Taiping Civil War. And this was a total war in the sense that it involved both women and children and civilians, and the destruction of towns, the destruction of crops, the destruction of any sort of industry that might have helped either side as the Qings fought against the Taipings. Eventually, a Manchurian army, the Qing army, calling itself the ever victorious army, defeated the Taipings. But the revolution went on, and it took 14 years to finally quell it. We believe that somewhere between 30 to 60 million Chinese were killed. Now there you see the flag of the Taipings, and that is the throne of the Taiping leaders, the Taiping emperors, in the city, not of Peking or Beijing as we call it today, but in the city of Nanking, which is now called Nanjing today. And keep that city, Nanjing, in the back of your heads, just as you would keep the city of Dresden in Germany in the back of your minds. We will return to Nanjing a little bit later. In the 1850s as well, the United States of America saw China as a great opportunity to expand its markets, but blocking the way to China were the Japanese islands. In 1853, with the prodding of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, President Franklin Pierce sent a flotilla to Japan, to Tokyo Bay, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. He was the younger brother of the famous Commander Oliver Hazard Perry, a hero of the War of 1812. Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay, pointed his guns at the Tokugawas, and said, "You are now going to open up with trade to the west." Outgunned, the Tokugawa shoguns immediately decided to open up Japan to outside trading, Japan which had been closed for 250 years. These Western incursions to Japan, this Western trade with Japan, led many of the ruling Japanese to realize that this time of great seclusion needed to come to an end, and that the Tokugawas themselves needed to stop the rule of Japan. Instead, the daimyo all rose up against the Tokugawas and said it is time to bring the emperor back. And so, in 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate ended, and the emperor was restored to full power and took the name Meiji, which means enlightened rule. This is the end of the Sakoku era, which is the era in which Japan was shut off from the rest of the world. It is also the end of Japan as a feudal society. It moves to a market economy, and it moves to innovation, to allow Western ideas in. Not all of the Tokugawas, or not all of the people who supported the Tokugawas, accepted this Meiji restoration, and so they carried on a war called the Boshin War, and this is the final defeat of the Tokugawas, and part of this is sort of reflected in that movie, The Last Samurai. Japan, from this point on, works to become a modern, technologically advanced nation, free from Western control. For while the Japanese acquiesced to the Western demand to open up their nation, they were bitterly resentful of this, and Japanese have very long memories. Nonetheless, the Japanese abolished the samurai class, which was about 1.9 million by this time, by the 1850s. They were far too many to support. Consider the French Revolution, where the French nobility was a much smaller portion of the nation. Japan mandated nationwide conscription for all males. It ended the four-class system that had been imposed on them by China, or had been brought over from China. The four-class system was you had the lords, and you had the merchant class, and the artisans, and then you had the peasants. This meant that Japanese could engage in upward mobility. The Tokugawas were a largely decentralized government. The Meiji Restoration now begins to centralize the government, and most importantly, Japan begins to industrialize. And almost from the very beginning that Japan begins to industrialize, it realizes that it does not have a lot of iron, it doesn't have a lot of coal, it doesn't have a lot of the minerals that are needed for industrialization. But the neighbors around it did, especially Manchuria and China and Indochina and Indonesia. Those areas would have the minerals that would be necessary for industrialization. And so Japan begins to see itself as interacting more with those areas, and then over time beginning to dominate those areas. There on the left you see Emperor Meiji, which brings an end to the Edo period. On the upper right is Commodore Matthew Perry. And the lower right, you see Perry and his officers prepared to meet representatives of the Tokugawas to sign the treaty that would open up Japan at last to the West. As the 19th century went on, and as nations begin to race more and more for empire, the issues of imperialism begin to raise their ugly heads, especially when it comes time for the customs of the colonizing nation to rub up against the customs of the native nations. The problem is that oftentimes native resistance leads to a more powerful colonial government at first. Case in point is India, which had been under the control of Britain. And when I talk about India, I talk about also Pakistan to the west, Bangladesh to the east, and it also includes Burma, which we call Myanmar today. The British East India Tea Company was the controlling government of India. The British East India Tea Company, you might recall from the days of the American Revolution, was a country within a country. They had their own army. They even coined their own currency. They had their own flag. And they ran India with a rather high-handed manner of running it. In 1857, the sepoys revolted, mutinied against the British East India Tea Company. Now, what are sepoys? Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were recruited into the BEITC army. Now, what were the issues that the sepoys had? Number one, they did not get promoted like regular British officers were. They didn't get paid as much as regular British officers were, and they resented this. There was also a lack of respect for social and religious customs. Now, the most important of these was the Enfield rifle, which is what the soldiers carried. In order to load an Enfield rifle, what you had to do was bite down on a powder cartridge and then put the powder into your rifle. That cartridge had been sealed with animal wax. If you're a Hindu sepoy and it is beef wax, that is considered to be not allowed. If you're Muslim and you're a sepoy and it's got pork wax on it, that is a major sin. The British East India Tea Company said, we don't give a damn about your customs, just be a good soldier. The sepoys mutinied. The other problem was land inheritance. The British East India Tea Company kept taking and taking and taking land away from the rulers of India through what was called the default rule, in which if you died, the British East India Tea Company wouldn't recognize the heirs, and therefore they would take the land. And this caused a major rebellion in 1857, and it is called the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And those of you who watch the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, they make reference to that early in the movie when they're having dinner, with that grotesque dinner with eyeballs and monkey brains and all that kind of stuff. The aftermath of the Sepoy Mutiny is that the British government finally tells the British East India Tea Company, you all do not need to exist anymore. You all have gotten too big and you're not representing the crown, and so they dissolve the BEITC. Instead, what they do is they impose what is known as the British Raj. This is direct control of Britain over the rule of India. And Queen Victoria becomes Empress of India in this way, and she issues a proclamation promising the Indians civil rights, which the British Parliament does not really respect. And so what you have is a situation in which 500 million Indians are governed by only a few thousand British. Furthermore, a strict segregation takes place of whites from the Hindu Indians. Now, the British did eradicate some of the customs that we would find quite horrific, like infanticide, child marriages, and the custom of sati, which is if a man died, you burned his widow with him. Problem was the widow might still be alive and you'd still burn him. The other byproduct of this is Indian families now begin to send their children to England to be educated. And one of those families was a family with the last name of Gandhi. Unlike the Indian Rebellion of 1947 that Gandhi led, the famous passive resistance campaign, the revolt of 1857 was not all throughout India. There were portions in the dark blue that were very much in favor of the rebels. But then there are other portions of India that were not in favor of the rebels at all. As a matter of fact, there were many Indians who very much liked British rule. They liked the British economy, the economical programs that they put on there. It is the fact that the British colonial rule after the British East India Tea Company left got to be so strict that eventually the Indians had said enough, but it would take almost a century to do that. British Empire also had its hands full in Africa with what was known as the Mahdist Revolt in 1885. This is the first major fundamentalist Islamic revolt, and it underscored very much the politics of empire. Why did the British get involved in the Sudan, which is to the south of Egypt? Because at that time, the Sudan was considered to be a part of Egypt. And Egypt was crucial to the British because that is where the canal is going to go that will help connect India to Britain by a much shorter route. But again, you get to see the resentment of the natives against the occupying forces, which are the British. But you also see that not everybody in Britain wants to get engaged in empire. The government of William Ewart Gladstone is very much reluctant to send an army and try and get involved too much in this squabble. Now, the Mahdist revolt follows from, and it's named after, the leader of this revolt, Muhammad Ahmad bin Abd Allah, who called himself the Mahdi. He was considered to be the spiritual successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And he is the one that leads this revolt in the Sudan. The British government sends General George Gordon. Full name was Charles George Gordon. He gets the nickname Chinese Gordon because he is the one that leads the Chinese army during the Taiping Rebellion that suppressed the Taiping. Gordon was sent there to try and evacuate the city of Khartoum, which is the city that sits at the confluence of the Blue and the Nile rivers in the Sudan today. Gordon gets there and he realizes that he cannot save everybody at Khartoum. And so he wires London and says, you need to send me an army right away so that we can get these people out of here. Well, Gladstone's dragging his feet. And then Gladstone orders Gordon and what British forces he has out of Khartoum. And Gordon disobeys the orders. He stays in Khartoum. He's going to defend it. He uses his skills as an engineer to dig a moat between the Blue and the Nile rivers so that Khartoum can be totally surrounded. But by January of 1885, the Nile has dropped, the river has dropped during the winter, and the trench is laid bare. And more than 100,000 Mahdist soldiers now run up against Khartoum, invade the city, and they kill Gordon. They behead him and parade around with his head on a stake, even though the Mahdi had personally said, do not kill Gordon. They slaughtered just about everybody who was there who was against them. George Gordon, Chinese Gordon, is the epitome of the typical Victorian. Personally, he was an absolute mess. He drank too much, he was disobedient, he was very flashy, but he's considered to be a hero in Britain. There's streets named after him, a statue to him, there's parks named after him. That's typical Victorian right there. On the surface, he's the hero. Behind the scenes, he was quite a hot mess of a human being. On the left is a map of the Sudan in those days, and you get to see the area that was claimed by the Mahdi as the new Mahdist kingdom, so to speak. You notice the region of Darfur, which was definitely in the news these last several decades. Part of Sudan has now broken away. It's now called the South Sudan. I believe they're working on getting another name for it. It escapes me at the moment. And on the right, you see where the Sudan and Khartoum are located on the map of Africa, which, of course, maps are very important, and I want you to be able to know where Khartoum is located. I do hope that you all take a moment to watch the movie Khartoum, starring Charlton Heston, old Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston, as General Gordon. It is a very good movie with some issues of historical accuracy, but nonetheless, a great movie. These are the two depictions of the killing of General Gordon. On the left is a very romanticized version as he stood upon the top of the stairs as the Mahdists were attacking him. The one on the right, far less romanticized, but it's probably more accurate. He, went down swinging in balls of fists and fury and so forth. And then, as I said, after they killed him, which was against the Mahdi's demand, they then brought the head of Gordon to him, and he was not pleased at all. Strangely enough, 6 months later, the Mahdi died, probably of typhoid fever. And 2 years later, the British finally took the Sudan back after a great deal of loss of life and a great deal of embarrassment for the Gladstone government. Further south in Africa was the most ambitious project of them all. Cecil Rhodes, whom you see in the picture there, was born in England, but he had very poor health in the wet climate of England, the cold wetness of England. And so his parents sent him to South Africa because it's a far drier, more desert climate. And there he really flourished. He managed to corner the market on diamond mining and helped create the De Beers Company, which is still in operation today. He helped create the British South Africa Company, which is very much like the British East India Tea Company. He became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, which is one of the 3 territories that would make up the Union of South Africa, which is now today the Republic of South Africa. There was the Cape Colony, there was the Transvaal, and then there was what was called the Orange Free State. Cecil Rhodes is a very complicated figure. He was incredibly ambitious, incredibly driven. He was also a homosexual. We know that quite well, and said, well, I don't have time to be a husband because I wouldn't be able to give my wife the attention that she deserves because I'm so busy into business. And he also had secret lovers who were men. This does not diminish the fact that he had the most ambitious plan of them all, which was called the Cairo to the Cape Railway. Remember, I had spoken a little bit about the United States with its transcontinental railroad. Now, Rhodes wanted to build a railroad that went from the southern tip of Africa at Cape Town all the way to the northern tip of Africa at Cairo. It was never completed. It still, to this day, hasn't been completed. Part of the reason is that it was blocked by the Germans, the Belgians, and the Portuguese, who had territories in Central Africa, and the British couldn't punch their way through. The other reason later on is that the governments of Central Africa have, shall we say, been something of a hot mess, and have just never been able to complete it. But there's still plenty of railways all throughout Africa. But what is this indicative of? Cecil Rhodes, who is, like many of our former statued Confederate soldiers and so forth, is being debated about tearing down his statues in Africa and in England and so forth, represents the British imperialism of Africa and the British attempt to control all of Africa. Here's a caricature of Cecil Rhodes called the Rhodes Colossus, after he announced plans for a telegraph line and a railway from Cape Town to Cairo. And you see him striding across the African continent. The race for empire of the 19th century really focused on Africa. You see in the pink the British areas of control, and as you go from south to north, you can see all the British possessions through which they wanted to build their railroad. But you notice that the Germans and the Belgians and the Portuguese and Mozambique stand in the way. Notice the French control of Western and Northern Africa to a large degree. I also have circled some of the major points there. You see Cairo, you see the city of Tripoli in Libya, near which is the other city of Benghazi, which has been in the news lately. You see the 2 countries of Liberia in light blue to the far west, and Abyssinia or Ethiopia to the far east of Africa. Those are the only 2 independent African nations on the continent at this particular time. I also have circled on the far west of Ethiopia, the country of Somalia. The British were not the only ones involved in empire. The French had been building empire for some time also. They solidified their control over Cochin China, which is southern Vietnam. And then they begin to impose French models of urban planning on cities like Saigon. So when you go to Saigon, it's very much like New Orleans in many ways, and that it is a French planned city, although New Orleans now has Spanish architecture in the French Quarter. They imposed French culture and the Roman Catholic Church on the Vietnamese elites. Remember that at the time that the Vietnam War begins to break out, the president of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, is a former Catholic priest whose brother is a Catholic priest and a bishop. And remember that nobody bakes bread like the Vietnamese, because I'm sure that you all either go to Dong Phuong or Hai Do Bakery to get what they have over there, which they bake better than the French do. Napoleon III also promoted the building of the Suez Canal under the leadership of the gentleman to the far left. His name is Ferdinand Marie de Lesseps. He built the Suez Canal, made it work, and with that, you did not have to sail around the tip of Africa to get into the Indian Ocean anymore. Now you could go through the Suez Canal. Of course, you all know that the Suez Canal has been in the news recently with that huge tanker that ran aground and they had to get it off. De Lesseps would later try and build a canal through Central America, but this failed. And the Americans then had to take over the project, and they eventually would build the Panama Canal. De Lesseps's great nephew would be named for him, De Lesseps S. Morrison, who would later become the mayor of New Orleans, and after whom that big ugly road in New Orleans East is named, Morrison Road. The French also had occupied all of Algeria by 1870, as you saw on the map that I posted previously. So this is understanding that the French are very much involved in empire during this period, and very soon the Germans are going to get involved as well. Now in this map you get to see the path of the Suez Canal. One of the strengths of the Suez Canal is that it does not need any locks to raise or lower ships. It goes from sea level to sea level without having any problems. The canal in Panama is going to need to have locks. The mid to late 19th century also saw the advent of realism. Realism is a depiction of subjects as they appear in real life. Realists rejected romanticism. The realist works depicted people of all classes and situations that arise in ordinary life, and often reflected the changes brought about by the industrial and commercial revolutions. Realism is primarily concerned with how things appear to the eye, rather than containing ideal representations of the world. Now, among the first to be in the artistic era was Edouard Manet, who was known for painting nudes. But then there were plenty of literary realists as well. Chief among them, Mary Ann Evans, who went by the pen name George Eliot. Her most famous work is Silas Marner, a novel that's very notable for its strong realism and its sophisticated treatment of a variety of issues ranging from religion to industrialization to community, and they couch it in the story of what is called the Bildungsroman, which is a coming-of-age story, and Silas Marner as he goes through society. Gustave Flaubert wrote Madame Bovary, which is the story of a lady named Madame Bovary who lives beyond her means in order to escape the boredom, the banality, the emptiness of provincial life. Charles Pierre Baudelaire wrote a book of poetry called Flowers of Evil that expresses the changing nature of beauty in the rapidly industrializing Paris during the 19th century. We're all very familiar with Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, and The Brothers Karamazov, which is a philosophical novel about questions of God, free will, and morality. When it came to opera, there is Giuseppe Verdi, who wrote La Traviata, which is based on a play, The Lady with the Camellias, written by Alexandre Dumas of the Three Musketeers fame. The opera and the book before tells the story of a love affair between a high-class prostitute who is ill with tuberculosis, what they called consumption back in the day, and a young upper-class idealistic man. Perhaps one of the most famous realists of all time is Richard Wagner. Wagner, about whom Mark Twain once said, "I love Wagner's music until I listen to it." Wagner wrote music and drama that aroused the audience's fear, the awe of the audience, to get the audience engaged emotionally in this. His composition that is well known as Der Ring des Nibelungen, and that features the famous hymn Ride of the Valkyrie. And it tells the epic story of the struggle of gods, heroes, and several mythical creatures over what is called the eponymous magic ring that grants domination over the entire world. A powerful ring that gives you domination over the entire world. Gee, we've seen this before, haven't we, or read about it? The drama and the intrigue continue through 3 generations of protagonists until the final cataclysm at the end of Götterdämmerung. And, part of it, this is touched upon in the Loci and, Norse legends like that. Wagner, very troubled soul. Hitler became very, very fond of his music later on. Wagner was one of those that promoted a national German culture. The top row, left to right, Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the name George Eliot. The center is Gustave Flaubert, and on the right, the very dour and stern-looking Charles Pierre Baudelaire. On the bottom row, left to right, is the painter Edward Manet. In the middle is Fyodor Dostoevsky, who is claimed to be the greatest writer of all of Russia, and the almost sneering figure of Richard Wagner, who grew up thinking that his stepfather was his father until he realized that his biological father, who died when he was only 6 weeks old, was a mid-level postal clerk. His stepfather is the one that gave him the love of the theater and imbued with him the love of music and sent him in that direction. What's that you say? I spoke about realistic art, so now you want to see some art from the realist painters? Why, absolutely. Let's start with Edward Manet's Olympia, which was painted in 1863. This painting shows a prostitute lounging in bed as a maidservant is bringing her flowers. The model that he had for this painting, the face, comes from a lady who herself was a great painter in her own right in the day. And the way in which she looks at the audience who's staring at her picture is a very challenging, almost a bring it on sort of look that Manet was very fond of doing in his paintings. Manet could also be more religious. This is the picture of the dead Christ with angels. He painted this in 1864. It now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This painting of Irish women harvesting potatoes is titled October by Jules Bastien Lepage. This was painted in 1878, well after the famine. It hangs in the National Gallery of Victoria, which is in Australia. Konstantin Savitsky was a Russian realist painter. He painted Repairing the Railway in 1874. Ford Madox Brown was an English realist. He painted this picture called The Last of England between 1852 and 1855. He was well known for his moralistic and religious style of paintings. Robert Henry was an American artist, considered to be one of the 3 greatest artists ever produced. This is called Snow in New York in 1902. It hangs in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The American artworks in realism were often called coming from the Ashcan school of realism and depicted life in New York, as you saw earlier. This is John French Sloane's painting McSorley's Bar, which he painted in 1912 and hangs in the Detroit Institute of Arts. One of the reasons that I'm posting this painting is that I also use this in my 2502 class when I teach about the Ashcan School in United States history. This, of course, is the Ride of the Valkyrie from Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen. You are very familiar with this music because it also is featured in the movie Apocalypse Now, as Robert Duvall and his cavalry helicopters are going to clear the landing zone so that they can put the boat into the river, and they use it to scare the Vietnamese. The 19th century also saw one of the great religious revival movements in the Roman Catholic Church. It had all centered upon a young girl named Marie Bernard Soubirous, who went by the name Bernadette. She lived in the city of Lourdes in the south of France near the Pyrenees. And there, in a grotto called Massabielle, which was essentially a trash dump, she began to see visions of a person that she called the Lady. What was happening is that in the mid to late 19th century, organized religion was changing among the workers and artisans. There was more spirituality, and spirituality was especially strong among women. Down in southwestern France, Bernadette Soubirous experienced visions of a lady that she said. Now, as it goes, what happened is that she began to dig into the ground upon the instructions of this lady and wash her face with the mud, at which point they said that she was crazy and took her away to essentially institutionalize her, at which point out of this trash dump grotto, a spring appeared and started bubbling out. And with these waters, numerous people began to become healed of their ailments. Some had cancers, some had arthritis, some had terrible skin diseases, and so forth. And 67 medical cures have been identified as inexplicable by the Catholic Church. It is very important to understand that Bernadette Soubirous never once said that this was the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary. She called her the Lady. When the local priest told Bernadette to ask the lady her name, she responded by saying, "I asked the lady her name, and she has said that I am the Immaculate Conception," which was a term that Bernadette Soubirous would not have known, being a young, poor girl from the southwest of France. At this point, the pastor of the local parish realized that something was going on, and the church began to investigate it. And as I said, 67 medical cures have been identified at Lourdes as inexplicable. Now today at Lourdes, there is a huge church. There's several hospitals. People can go and drink from the spring of Lourdes that they have fixed taps to. They bring water in from the spring to the hospitals. It is the most visited Catholic holy site outside of the Middle East. The institutional church, that is the papacy itself, was now caught in a period of transition and crisis. You will recall that the Papal States had been forcibly taken away from the Pope, and Pius IX had declared himself prisoner of the Vatican. The Church was at odds everywhere in the heated atmosphere of realpolitik. In 1864, Pius IX issued what was known as the Syllabus of Errors, in which he basically said what's wrong with the world and the way the world is going right now, with industrialization and with secularization and with democracy and things like that. In 1870, with the French no longer protecting the Pope, and the Pope having lost the Papal States, the bishops of the church were called into the First Vatican Council. And there they affirmed what was known as the doctrine of papal infallibility. That is, if the Pope is to speak on any matter of deep faith or morals, he speaks without error. Now, does this mean that every time the Pope opens his mouth, he is speaking truth? No, that's not the case at all. There is very few instances of when the Pope is actually speaking infallible. In fact, it has been done only twice. The first time was to affirm the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is the belief that the Blessed Mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was born without the stain of original sin. Many people don't understand that the Immaculate Conception is not the sinless birth of Jesus. It's the sinless birth of Mary, because it's believed, according to church tradition, that the womb that bears Christ does not bear the stain of original sin. There is no biblical proof or confirmation of this. They don't speak about it anywhere in the Bible other than to say that Mary is full of grace and that the Lord is with her. The second instance of papal infallibility is again an extra biblical event, the Assumption of the Blessed Mother. Now, the work of the First Vatican Council went unfinished because of the Franco-Prussian War. And so many of the French cardinals had to return home because the German cardinals were returning home and they didn't want to have a big fight down in Rome at this particular time. Now, in 1878, Pope Leo XIII began the process of reconciliation. Leo XIII was a very worldly political pope, an excellent pope in many ways, although he is not canonized a saint. He begins to encourage up-to-date Catholic scholarship. That is, he wants Catholics to start reading the Bible more, examining the Bible more, going back to the original Greek texts of the Bible and updating it. In addition to this, Leo XIII is something of a political liberal, where Pius IX wanted to reject all aspects of democracy in his Syllabus of Errors. Pope Leo XIII accepted many aspects of democracy and said this is the way of the world and the church must adjust in part to the way the world is going. This is a black and white depiction of the bishops of the church gathered inside St. Peter's Basilica for the First Vatican Council that opened in 1870. Now, it disbanded in 1871, but the First Vatican Council did not actually come to an end until 1962, when Pope John XXIII called the Second Vatican Council, which many Catholics refer to today, especially the older Catholics, as Vatican II. And the Second Vatican Council is the one in which the Church is really going to update itself and speak the language of the vernacular and masses, change the direction, the way the priests would face the congregation instead of the Blessed Sacrament and so forth. But that's another lesson for another time.